In the beginning, the world was a place of harmony where Adam and Eve lived in perfect communion with God in the Garden of Eden. However, once they broke God's command and ate from the forbidden fruit, they were cast out of Eden, and their lives took a dramatic turn. This marked the start of humanity's story, a story shaped by inner struggles, the effort to survive, and the quest to find meaning in a world that was no longer perfect. Cain, their firstborn son, was born into a changed world. He was strong, determined, and deeply connected to the earth. In a world where hard work was essential for survival, Cain quickly learned to till the soil, to deepen the furrows, and to labor for each harvest. The earth and the effort it demanded seemed to be all he had, and he believed that through hard work he would find his value in this world. Abel, on the other hand, was the younger brother. He had a more tranquil nature and tended to the sheep. He grazed the flocks on green pastures, and his life seemed to be one of peace, fulfilled by a deeper sense of connection to God. Unlike Cain, who believed that through physical labor he proved his worth, Abel felt a closer bond with God through the simplicity of his work. He understood that sacrifice wasn't just an act of giving, but a way of honoring and respecting the gifts received from the Creator. Don't forget to like and share with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories, and turn on the bell to receive notifications firsthand. We want to hear your opinion. Comment below on what you think of this video and share your thoughts with us. Let's be part of this journey of faith and learning together. As the years passed, Cain and Abel grew increasingly different, each following his own path, shaped by his nature and vision of the world. Cain was proud of his hard labor, of the exhaustion that came with each harvest. Abel, however, seemed to live a quieter life, free of the exhausting struggles of the land. This difference began to define their relationship, and an unspoken competition grew between them.
Cain and Abel, raised in the same family and under similar circumstances, had different views on how to relate to God. Cain believed that physical labor was the only way to approach the Creator, and that success in his work should be rewarded. Abel, however, understood the offering of a sacrifice not as a transaction, but as an act of pure devotion, a gift from the heart to God. He didn't expect a reward. Rather, he was devoted to offering his best with gratitude. While both brothers worked the land, their differences were clear. Cain offered the fruits of his labor, the tangible results of his hard work, while Abel offered a sheep from his flock, one of the best he had. Abel's sacrifice wasn't just a gift, but a symbol of a deeper relationship with God, one in which he understood that sacrifice meant not just giving, but offering something precious and living. This contrast between Cain and Abel was not only in their lifestyle, but in their understanding of their relationship with God. And it would become the foundation for the conflict that would unfold. Cain and Abel were not merely two brothers bringing gifts to God, but two souls struggling with their own understanding of how to honor the Creator and what that truly meant. The stage was set for a choice that would alter the course of history. As the years passed, Cain and Abel's differences grew more pronounced. Each continued to live according to his nature. Cain worked tirelessly to cultivate the land, while Abel tended to the sheep with a quiet devotion. Both brothers, eager to offer their best to God, decided to present sacrifices. Each of them believed that their offering would be a reflection of their devotion and connection to the Creator. But as it would soon be revealed, their paths to God were not equally received.
Cain, ever the hard worker, brought the fruits of the earth as his offering, the crops he had labored so intensely to grow. He presented what he believed to be the best he could offer, the tangible results of his sweat and effort. To him, his offering was an expression of his hard work and his desire to honor God through his labor. It was a gift born from toil, and in his mind, it was more than enough. Abel, however, brought something different. He presented a lamb from his flock, the best he had. He did not bring the fruit of his own labor, but instead offered the life of a creature he had cared for and nurtured. Abel's sacrifice was not just an act of giving something, it was a gesture that spoke of his heart's devotion. His offering was living, pure, and humble, reflecting a deep understanding of what it meant to honor God. When the sacrifices were presented, God's response was swift and clear. God accepted Abel's offering with favor, but Cain's offering was not accepted. The rejection was not because of the quality of Cain's labor, but because of the spirit in which it was offered. Abel's sacrifice, a living and humble offering, was received because it reflected his heart's true reverence for God. Cain's sacrifice, though born of hard work, lacked that same purity and humility. Cain had given what he thought was good enough, but it did not come from the right place. It came from duty rather than devotion. This divine rejection of his offering struck Cain deeply. The anger that had been building inside him now had an outlet. His pride and confusion clashed with his internal frustration. Why was Abel's offering accepted and his own rejected? Cain had worked so hard, sacrificed so much. Was his labor not enough? His mind raced, and in that moment, the seeds of resentment and envy began to take root in his heart. Cain's desire for validation through his hard work clouded his ability to see what God truly wanted, a sincere heart, not just the result of physical effort. God, seeing the turmoil rising within Cain, came to him with a message of guidance and warning. Why are you angry? If you do well, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do well, sin lies at the door. Its desire is for you, but you should rule over it. God's words were not a condemnation, but a call for Cain to examine his heart and motivations. Cain's anger was not just about the sacrifice, it was about his own failure to understand what God truly desired. Not the fruits of his labor, but the sincerity of his heart.
But instead of listening to God's words, Cain's jealousy and anger overtook him. The bitterness that had begun to fester grew stronger, and the seed of resentment blossomed into a dangerous obsession. He could not shake the image of Abel's favored offering, and the thought of being overshadowed by his brother consumed him. God had given Cain a chance to reconcile, to understand that the problem was not his work, but his heart's disposition. Yet Cain, driven by envy and a desire for validation, could not let go of the perceived injustice. Rather than turning to God for clarity and seeking a path of redemption, Cain made a fatal choice, one that would change the course of his life and history forever. Cain's heart had been consumed by jealousy. The rejection of his sacrifice, though it came with a divine warning, had ignited a fire that burned deep within him. His pride, his sense of injustice, and his resentment toward Abel for receiving God's favor instead of him began to shape his every thought. He could not escape the feeling of being overlooked, unappreciated, and unloved. Abel had done nothing wrong, yet in Cain's mind, he was the one who had worked harder, who had given more, and still, Abel was the one accepted by God. Instead of reflecting on God's words, Cain allowed his anger to fester. The warning about sin lying at the door, waiting to overtake him, went unheard. Instead of mastering his emotions and turning to God for understanding, Cain allowed his envy to drive him further away from the truth. It became clear that Cain did not truly seek reconciliation or understanding. His desire was not for God's will, but for the validation of his own actions. And in his heart, he began to rationalize his hatred for Abel, believing that if Abel were gone, he would finally receive the acknowledgement he so desperately craved.
One day, Cain and Abel were alone in the fields, far from the village where others could witness what was about to happen. Cain, consumed by the darkness of his thoughts, invited Abel to walk with him. Abel, trusting his older brother, agreed without question. The air was thick with tension, though neither of them spoke of it. For Cain, the weight of his emotions was unbearable. He felt suffocated by his jealousy and anger, and though he knew what he was about to do, he felt trapped in his own rage.
As they walked, Cain's mind raced. He could feel the seed of violence taking root in his heart, but at that moment, he could not see the full consequences of his actions. He only saw the injustice, the perceived slight that Abel had unwittingly inflicted upon him by receiving God's favor. Abel, so innocent, so unaware of the storm raging within his brother, was walking to his death. In one swift, violent motion, Cain struck Abel down. The blow was decisive, and Abel crumpled to the ground, lifeless. The world seemed to stop as Cain stood over his brother's body. His breathing was heavy, his hands shaking, and for the first time he felt the full weight of his actions. There was no turning back. The blood of Abel stained the earth beneath them, and in that moment, Cain knew that his life would never be the same. Cain stood in stunned silence for a moment, his mind racing with a mix of guilt, anger, and disbelief. The reality of what he had done began to sink in, but it was too late for remorse. Abel, his brother, his flesh and blood, was gone. Cain had taken his life in a moment of blind rage, and now, in the quiet aftermath, the true horror of his actions began to unfold. God's presence was no longer a gentle guiding force. Now it was a demand for accountability. It was not just a question of Cain's actions, but a confrontation with his soul. God called out to Cain from heaven asking, "Where is your brother Abel?" The question was simple, but it carried with it the weight of eternity. It was not just an inquiry, it was a call to Cain to confront what he had done. Cain, in a mixture of guilt and defiance, responded, "I do not know. Am I my brother's keeper?" His words were cold, a denial not just of the act, but of his own responsibility. He sought to evade the truth, to escape the consequences of his crime. But God, who saw everything, knew the truth. The silence that followed was deafening, and the gravity of Cain's sin could not be undone by a lie.
God spoke again, this time with a sorrowful authority. "What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying out to me from the ground. And now you are cursed from the earth, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood. When you till the ground, it will no longer yield to you its strength. You will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth." The weight of these words crushed Cain. He had not only killed his brother, but he had also set himself on a path of eternal wandering, never again to have a place of rest. The earth that had once been his ally, his companion in work, would now reject him. He would toil for the rest of his life, but the fruits of his labor would never be as bountiful as before. His punishment was severe, but it was also a reflection of the deep spiritual void that his actions had created within him. Cain, in the midst of his anguish, responded with a cry of despair. "My punishment is greater than I can bear. Behold, you have driven me today away from the face of the ground, and from your face I will be hidden. I will be a fugitive and a wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." Cain's words were a reflection of the deep isolation and fear that now consumed him. He was not only afraid of others' retribution, but he also feared the absence of God's presence in his life. He had turned his back on the Creator and had embraced sin. And now, even in the face of punishment, he felt that he was being abandoned forever. But even in the midst of Cain's despair, God showed him mercy. "Not so," said the Lord. "If anyone kills Cain, vengeance shall be taken on him sevenfold." And God put a mark on Cain, so that no one would harm him. This mark, though it was a sign of Cain's sin, was also a sign of divine mercy. God had not abandoned Cain completely, though his punishment was just. The mark was a reminder of his actions and a protective sign, allowing him to live, but with the heavy burden of his crime always on his shoulders.
Cain, now marked and cursed, left the presence of the Lord and wandered the earth, carrying the weight of his sin and the consequences of his actions. He had killed his brother, and though he would live, his life would never be the same. He was now a wanderer, marked by both his crime and God's mercy, and though his days would be long, they would be filled with the unrelenting reminder of the choice he had made. Cain wandered through the earth, a fugitive and a wanderer, carrying the weight of his crime with each step. The mark that God had placed upon him served as both a reminder of his guilt and a sign of protection, but it also isolated him from the rest of the world. No matter where he went, he could not escape the voice of his brother's blood crying out from the ground. His heart, once full of pride and ambition, was now heavy with regret and confusion. The earth, which had once yielded abundant harvests for him, now resisted his every effort. Where once his work had been rewarded with bountiful crops, now the soil barely gave back what he had planted. The curse was not just physical, it was spiritual. Cain felt the distance between himself and God more acutely with each passing day. He knew that the divine presence, which had once guided him, was now withdrawn. The consequence of his sin was not only the death of Abel, but also the severing of his connection with God. As he traveled, Cain encountered other people, but each encounter felt like a confrontation with his own failure. He was now an outsider, living among strangers who were unaware of the terrible crime he had committed. They saw him as just another man, but Cain could not escape the truth of who he was, a murderer, a man marked and rejected by God. The weight of his actions hung over him like a shadow that he could never escape. For the first time, Cain began to understand the depth of the emptiness that his sin had created within him. The anger and jealousy that had once driven him to murder were gone, replaced by a profound sadness and a desire for peace that seemed unattainable. He had destroyed his relationship with his brother, and in doing so, he had destroyed his own peace. The very act of killing Abel had created a wound in his soul that he could not heal.
In the silence of his isolation, Cain began to reflect on his choices. He remembered the warning God had given him, that sin desired to dominate him, but that he could master it. But how could he, after what he had done? The guilt was overwhelming, and Cain could not see a way forward. How could he ever be redeemed for such a terrible act? Could he ever truly find peace, or would he forever be haunted by the memory of his brother's blood? One night, as he sat alone by a campfire, Cain's thoughts turned to his past. He thought of his parents, Adam and Eve, and how they must have felt after his crime. He thought of the love they had shown him when he was a child, and the hope they had for him to carry on their legacy. How could he ever face them again? How could he ever look them in the eyes after what he had done? The shame of his actions seemed unbearable. But even in the depths of his despair, Cain knew that he could not continue to run from his past. God had given him a mark, a protection, but it was also a constant reminder of his sin. It was a sign that he was not beyond redemption, but it was also a sign that he would never be the same. The road ahead would be long, and the burden of his guilt would never leave him. But in that moment, Cain understood that the path to peace began with acceptance of his sin and acceptance of the consequences. For the first time since he had killed Abel, Cain began to consider the possibility of redemption. It would not come easily, and it would not come from anyone else. It would come from within him, from his willingness to face the truth of his actions and to seek forgiveness, not just from God, but from himself. The journey ahead was still unclear, but Cain knew that he could not go on living in denial. He had to confront what he had done, and only then could he hope to find a way forward. But the question remained: could a man like Cain ever truly be forgiven? Could a murderer ever find peace, or was he doomed to wander forever, consumed by the weight of his own sin? Only time would tell. For now, all he could do was keep walking, keep reflecting, and keep trying to make sense of a world that no longer made sense to him.
Cain's journey of self-exile continued, and with each passing day, the weight of his crime pressed harder against him. No matter how far he traveled, no matter how many places he visited, he could not escape the echoes of his past. The image of Abel's lifeless body haunted him, and the memory of the blood that stained the earth seemed to follow him wherever he went. He was marked not only physically by God's protection and the curse, but spiritually by the sin he could never undo. Each night, as he laid beneath the stars, Cain wrestled with himself. He had no answers to his questions, no clarity about his future. The bitterness that once fueled his anger had faded, replaced by a deep sorrow and a gnawing sense of helplessness. He had killed his brother, and now he faced a lifetime of wandering and regret. Could he ever find a way to live with himself again? Or was his existence now just a long penance for a crime that could never be undone? Despite the weight of his guilt, there was still a part of Cain that refused to give in completely. His survival instinct remained strong, and he continued moving forward, trying to make a life for himself wherever he could. He worked with his hands, sowing crops, building shelters, and living off the land. But the labor, once a means of earning a living, had become a reminder of his isolation. The earth that he once knew so well now seemed to reject him, yielding only the barest of harvests. Even the most basic act of survival felt tainted by his sin. In the quiet of the night, Cain thought about God's words to him long ago. Sin lies at the door and desires to master you, but you must rule over it. At the time, he had dismissed these words, thinking they didn't apply to him. Now they haunted him. He had failed to master his anger, his jealousy, and his pride, and those feelings had led him to murder. Sin had mastered him, and he was now living with the consequences. But Cain began to wonder, was it too late to learn to rule over it? Could he ever control the rage that still simmered deep inside him? Or had his sin already sealed his fate? One evening, while walking through a dense forest, Cain stumbled upon a small clearing where a group of people had gathered. They were simple folk, humble in their ways, and they welcomed him without question. For the first time in a long while, Cain felt a sense of connection, a flicker of hope. These people did not know who he was, nor did they know the darkness that haunted him. They treated him with kindness, offering him food and shelter, as though he were just another traveler seeking rest.
As he sat by their fire, listening to their stories and watching the flickering flames, Cain felt a strange sensation, a longing for something he had not felt in a long time: peace. These people, despite their struggles, seemed to possess a peace that Cain had lost long ago. In their simplicity, they had found a way to live in harmony with the world and with each other. And Cain, in his brokenness, realized that he had been searching for this peace all along, though he had never known it would be found in such an unexpected place. That night, as he lay in his bedroll, Cain's thoughts turned inward once again. Could he ever live a life like theirs? Could he ever find redemption, or was he doomed to wander the earth, marked by his sin until the end of his days? For the first time in years, he allowed himself to entertain the idea that redemption might still be possible. It would not come easily. He would have to face the full weight of his actions, to confront the man he had become and the man he could still be. But the first step, he realized, was accepting that the possibility of change existed. The path ahead was uncertain, but Cain knew that he had to start somewhere. He could no longer keep running from his past, nor could he deny the pain and shame that came with it. But in the quiet of that night, as he looked up at the stars, he felt a small but growing sense of hope. Maybe, just maybe, he could learn to rule over the sin that had consumed him. And perhaps, in time, he could find a way to make amends, not just with God, but with himself. For the first time in years, Cain believed that a life of peace, though still distant, might one day be within reach. As the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Cain found himself continuing to live among the people who had shown him unexpected kindness. His life had taken a different shape than it ever had before, but even in this modest existence, the shadow of his past still loomed large. His days were filled with work, the rhythms of the earth and the small joys of being part of a community. However, every night, in the solitude of his thoughts, Cain grappled with the same unresolved questions that had plagued him for years. Can a man like me ever change? And can I ever find peace after what I've done? Though he had learned to find a degree of peace in the simplicity of his new life, there was still a gnawing emptiness within him. It was not the kind of emptiness that could be filled by work or community, nor by any of the small comforts he had come to appreciate. No, the emptiness was deeper, and it was tied to the memory of what he had done: the murder of his brother, the loss of his innocence, and the irreplaceable rupture in his relationship with God. The people he lived with seemed content in their way of life, and Cain began to admire them for their ability to live in harmony with each other, to forgive, and to find meaning in their daily tasks. He could not help but feel a profound sense of longing for that kind of peace. He had spent so much of his life struggling with anger and bitterness, convinced that the world owed him something, that if only his efforts had been recognized, if only God had accepted his sacrifice, things would have been different. But as time passed, Cain began to realize that his struggles had been self-imposed. His anger, his pride, and his jealousy were the very forces that had driven him to kill his brother, and it was those same forces that kept him in chains, unable to move forward. One evening, while sitting by the fire, Cain found himself talking to one of the older men in the village. The man had lived through much and had seen both the beauty and the tragedy of life. Cain, in his quiet desperation, asked the man, "How do you find peace? How do you move forward after something terrible has happened?" The old man looked at him with understanding eyes and said simply, "You must first forgive yourself. Only then can you find the peace you seek."
Those words hit Cain harder than he expected. He had spent so much time running from his guilt, from the memory of Abel's death, that he had never stopped to think about forgiveness. Not from God, not from others, but from himself. The idea of forgiving himself seemed impossible. How could he forgive himself for killing his own brother, for breaking the trust that had once existed between them? But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that without self-forgiveness, he could never truly find redemption. The next few days were filled with Cain's internal struggle. He knew that forgiveness did not come easily, especially when the weight of such a crime hung over him. But he also knew that in order to move forward, he would have to confront the darkness that had consumed him for so long. Each time the memory of Abel's death resurfaced, Cain fought the urge to bury it deep inside. He had spent so many years running from it, but now, for the first time, he understood that facing it was the only way to heal. He spent long hours in the quiet of the village, walking the paths where he had once toiled so many years ago. As he walked, he reflected on his past and the pain he had caused, not only to Abel, but to himself. Cain realized that every part of his life had been overshadowed by the sin of that one moment. And yet, the more he reflected, the more he understood that if he continued to let that one sin define him, he would never be free. One evening, as the sun began to set and the sky turned to shades of orange and pink, Cain found himself standing on a hill overlooking the village below. The calm of the landscape seemed to echo the peace he was beginning to feel within himself. He took a deep breath, and for the first time in a long while, he felt a glimmer of hope.
Perhaps, just perhaps, he could change. Not all at once and not without struggle, but he could begin by accepting the truth of his actions and acknowledging the consequences. The forgiveness he sought would not come in a single moment, but in small steps, in the way he treated others, in the way he allowed himself to make amends, and in the way he learned to live with the past while looking forward to the future. Cain had spent years wandering in search of peace, but now he realized that the peace he sought was not something he could find by running. It was something he had to create within himself. And for the first time, he believed that it was possible. In the months that followed, Cain continued to wrestle with the battle raging inside him. He had spent so much of his life in denial, in anger, in jealousy, but now he was faced with the daunting task of trying to heal the wounds he had inflicted on himself and on those around him. The process was slow, and the pain of confronting his past never fully dissipated, but he felt something shifting in his heart, a fragile but growing understanding that redemption was not only about forgiveness from others, but about forgiving himself. Cain had always believed that peace could only come if he could somehow make amends for the terrible thing he had done. He thought that perhaps if he could do enough good, if he could work hard enough, or if he could offer enough sacrifices, he would somehow earn the forgiveness he so desperately craved. But now, he was learning that redemption wasn't about earning forgiveness or working to be worthy of it. It was about accepting the reality of his actions and the consequences they carried, while also accepting the possibility of change.
One evening, while sitting near the edge of the village, Cain reflected on the words the old man had shared with him, "You must forgive yourself." He had heard these words many times before, but it wasn't until now that they began to make sense. The hardest part of his journey wasn't confronting the world around him, but confronting himself, his pride, his guilt, and the deep gnawing sense of shame that had held him captive for so long. He had been running from himself, from his sin, but now he realized that running would never bring him peace. Only facing what he had done and accepting that he could not change it would allow him to move forward. The village, with its quiet simplicity, had become a place of healing for Cain. The people there had no idea of his past, but they treated him with a kindness that he had never known. In their presence, he began to experience something he hadn't felt in years, a sense of belonging. He worked with them, helped them with their harvest, and in doing so, he started to feel useful again, not as a man marked by a past crime, but as a man contributing to something greater than himself. But even in the midst of this newfound peace, Cain knew that the real work lay within him. He had to learn to live with the memory of Abel, and to accept that he could never undo the harm he had caused. There would always be moments when the weight of his guilt would return, when the face of his brother would flash before him, and when the regret would threaten to consume him again. But Cain had come to understand that this was not a battle to be won by trying to erase the past, but by learning to live with it. One day, as Cain worked in the fields, a young boy came to him asking for help with the crops. The boy had heard that Cain was a skilled worker and wanted to learn how to tend the land properly. At first, Cain hesitated, unsure of whether he was capable of teaching anyone after everything he had done. But as he looked into the boy's eager eyes, he saw something he hadn't seen in himself for a long time: hope.
Over the next few weeks, Cain took the boy under his wing, teaching him the ways of the land. As they worked together, Cain began to realize that he was not only teaching the boy how to work the earth, but also how to heal. The boy's presence reminded him that life went on, that there was always the potential for new growth, even after the harshest seasons. The earth, though it had once rejected him, was now a place of learning, of planting new seeds, both in the ground and in his own heart. The more time Cain spent working with the boy, the more he began to feel a sense of purpose again. He was no longer defined by his past, but by his actions in the present. Every time he helped the boy, every time he taught him a new skill, Cain felt a little more at peace. He realized that this was his path to redemption, not through grand gestures or seeking forgiveness from those he could never repay, but through the simple act of helping others, of contributing to the world in a positive way. One evening, after a long day's work, Cain sat alone in the quiet of his small hut. The sky was a deep purple, the stars twinkling faintly above. For the first time in years, Cain didn't feel consumed by guilt or regret. Instead, he felt a sense of calm, a quiet understanding that while he could never undo what he had done, he could choose to move forward. The burden of his past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had to define him. He could choose to live differently, to make better choices, and to seek peace, not by erasing the past, but by accepting it and using it to guide him toward a better future. Cain had learned that true redemption wasn't something that could be granted by others. It was something that had to come from within. He had spent so much of his life running from his mistakes, but now, for the first time, he was ready to face them. And as he looked up at the stars, he felt a flicker of hope, a hope that, despite the darkness of his past, there was still light ahead.
The days turned into weeks, and Cain continued his life in the village, finding solace in the rhythm of work, the kindness of the people around him, and the quiet moments of reflection. Though his guilt and shame still lingered, there was something different now. He had begun to see the possibility of change, of redemption, and of peace. But the road to inner peace was still long, and Cain knew that he would have to confront his past again and again before he could truly be free. One afternoon, as he was working the fields, Cain had a moment of quiet realization.
The memories of Abel had always haunted him, but now they no longer brought the same overwhelming pain. Instead, there was a tenderness to them, a recognition of the love he had once shared with his brother, and a deeper understanding of the fragility of life. Cain had spent so long focusing on the violence and anger that had driven him to murder, that he had forgotten the moments of connection, the bond of brotherhood, the time they had spent together before that fateful day. In this moment of clarity, Cain realized that in order to move forward, he needed to honor Abel's memory, not by trying to undo the wrong, but by living in a way that would make Abel proud. He needed to forgive himself, not because he could erase his past, but because only through self-forgiveness could he hope to find peace. The shame that had kept him isolated and disconnected from others was slowly lifting, and in its place was a humble acceptance of who he was, flaws and all. That evening, after a long day's work, Cain sat alone by the fire, reflecting on the journey he had undertaken. He had been a man driven by pride, anger, and jealousy, but now, after years of wandering and struggling with his guilt, he could feel the weight of his past beginning to loosen. The pain of what he had done would never fully fade, but he had come to understand that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about learning to live with it and choosing to grow from it.
The boy Cain had mentored came to sit beside him, as he often did in the evenings. Cain had taught the boy everything he knew about farming, but now, in many ways, the boy was teaching him something more important: how to live with hope, how to keep moving forward even when the past seemed impossible to overcome. The boy didn't know about Cain's past, and Cain didn't intend to tell him. But in their quiet companionship, Cain began to feel that he had found a new family, a new sense of belonging. It was a simple life, but it was real, and for the first time in many years, it felt like enough. As they sat together by the fire, the boy spoke softly, asking Cain questions about his life. "You've lived many years," the boy said, his voice full of curiosity. "What do you think makes life worth living?" Cain thought for a moment, looking into the boy's eager eyes. "I think it's about making each day count," Cain said slowly, his voice steady. "It's about helping others, doing what you can to make the world a little better. I've made many mistakes in my life, but I've learned that it's not too late to change. It's never too late to try to make amends." The boy nodded thoughtfully, his face reflecting the innocence and optimism that Cain had lost long ago. That night, as Cain lay in his bed, he thought about those words. It's never too late to try to make amends. He had spent so many years running from his guilt, thinking that there was no way out, but now he saw that redemption wasn't a single event, but a lifetime of choices. Each day was a chance to do better, to be better, to forgive himself and others, and to make peace with the world. In the quiet of the night, Cain felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: hope. Not the kind of hope that came from expecting everything to be made right, but the kind of hope that came from within. The hope that, no matter what had happened in the past, there was still a future worth living for. He knew that the journey would not be easy, but for the first time, he felt ready to face whatever came next. As he drifted off to sleep, Cain whispered a prayer, not asking for forgiveness, but for strength. Strength to continue walking the path of redemption, and strength to carry the lessons of his past into the future. The road ahead was still uncertain, but Cain had finally accepted that, no matter what, he had the power to choose how he would live from this moment on. And that was enough. As the seasons passed, Cain continued his quiet life in the village,
where he had found a sense of belonging and purpose that he had long sought. His days were filled with hard work, but this time his labor was different. He no longer toiled with the bitterness of the past, but with a quiet sense of gratitude. He knew that peace was something he had to build each day, step by step. And every step he took was a small victory over the man he had been, the man who had once been driven by anger and jealousy. Yet even with the peace he had found, Cain could not fully escape the whispers of his past. They followed him like shadows, especially during the quiet moments of the night when he would reflect on his journey. The weight of Abel's death still clung to him, though it no longer consumed him. He had made peace with it in a way, but every so often the memory of that moment would surface, and he would be reminded of the terrible thing he had done.
One evening, as Cain walked through the fields after a long day of work, he noticed something different in the air. There was a heaviness to the sky, and the wind whispered of a coming storm. His heart felt uneasy, as though something was about to change, something he could not control. It was then that he realized how much he had come to rely on the stability of his new life, the routine that had brought him comfort. And yet, in the back of his mind, he knew that life was never without its challenges. The past, with all its pain and mistakes, had shaped him, but the future was still unwritten. The next morning, a stranger arrived in the village. He was a man of few words, but his presence commanded attention. His clothes were simple but sturdy, and his eyes held a quiet wisdom. He sought out Cain, having heard rumors of a man who had once been a wanderer and was now living in the village, finding peace after a troubled past. "I've heard of you," the stranger said, his voice calm and measured. "I've heard you've been seeking redemption for your actions. But I wonder, do you truly believe that peace can come from such things? That your past can be erased by good deeds alone?" Cain looked into the stranger's eyes and saw a reflection of the struggle that still raged within him. "I don't know if it can be erased," Cain replied softly, "but I believe peace can be found in the journey, in trying to live better, in learning from mistakes. It's not about forgetting, but about choosing to live differently." The stranger nodded, as though he understood. He looked at Cain for a long moment before speaking again. "Perhaps you do seek redemption, but true peace will come not just from trying to change your ways, but from accepting the full weight of what you've done. Only then can you move forward." Cain felt the truth of the man's words deep in his chest. He had accepted his past in many ways, but he had never fully confronted it, not in the way that the stranger was suggesting. It was one thing to acknowledge his sin, to live with the consequences, but it was another to truly face the depth of what he had done, to accept that his actions had forever altered the course of his life and the lives of those around him. Over the next few days, Cain spent long hours reflecting on the stranger's words. He spent time in solitude, working the fields, but his thoughts were consumed with the idea of truly facing his past. He had been running from it for so long, trying to build a new life without fully confronting the depth of his sin. But the truth was, he could never fully heal until he embraced it. The pain, the regret, and the responsibility for what he had done. That night, as he sat alone under the vast sky, Cain made a decision. He would go to the place where it all began, the place where he had killed Abel. He would face the land that had soaked in his brother's blood and confront the reality of what he had done. It was the only way, he realized, to find true peace. The journey back was long, and the weight of the past seemed to grow heavier with every step. But Cain knew that he could not move forward without first confronting the darkness that had shaped him. As he reached the place where he had murdered Abel, the memories flooded back. He could see the scene as if it were happening all over again. The violence, the anger, the moment when everything had spiraled out of control.
But as he stood there, looking at the ground where his brother had fallen, something inside him shifted. For the first time, he didn't feel consumed by anger or regret. Instead, he felt a deep sorrow, not just for Abel, but for himself. He had been lost in his emotions and in his need for validation. But now, in this quiet moment, he understood that redemption wasn't about erasing the past. It was about facing it and learning from it. Cain knelt on the ground, placing his hands on the earth where Abel's blood had once stained it. "I am sorry," he whispered, not to anyone, but to the earth, to the memory of his brother, and to himself. "I am truly sorry." For the first time, Cain felt the weight of his guilt begin to lift. It was not gone, but it was no longer suffocating him. He had faced his sin, truly faced it, and in doing so, he felt a small glimmer of peace. It would not come all at once, and there would still be days of struggle, but for the first time in a long while, Cain felt that he was on the right path. As he left the place where it all began, Cain knew that his journey was far from over, but now, for the first time, he believed that he could continue forward with hope. After facing the place where his brother's life had been taken, Cain felt a shift in his soul. It was not a miraculous transformation, but a quiet change that stirred deep within him. The weight of his sin had not disappeared, nor would it ever fully leave him, but for the first time, Cain felt a sense of release, as if a heavy chain had been loosened, allowing him to breathe more freely. He had confronted the darkest part of his past, and in doing so, he had allowed a flicker of hope to reignite within him.
Returning to the village, Cain felt different. He was not the same man who had first arrived, haunted by his guilt and running from the truth. He had walked back into the past, faced the ugliness of what he had done, and in that confrontation, he found a new way forward. While the journey ahead was still unclear, for the first time, he was ready to face it without running, without hiding from the reality of his actions. The people of the village had no idea of the weight Cain had carried all these years. To them, he was simply another member of their community, a man who worked diligently alongside them. Yet in his heart, Cain knew he was no longer the same. He had given himself the gift of self-forgiveness, and through that, he had opened the door to the possibility of healing, not just for himself, but for those around him as well. He became more involved in the village, not out of a need for redemption from others, but because he genuinely wanted to contribute. He helped in ways big and small, from tending to the fields to offering advice to those in need. It wasn't about seeking validation or approval. It was about using the lessons he had learned to make a positive impact on the world around him. But even in the midst of this newfound peace, Cain still wrestled with the lingering doubt, a voice that sometimes whispered that he was not worthy of the life he had now. It was easy to fall into the trap of thinking that his past, marked by such a profound sin, meant he could never truly live in peace. But as the days turned into weeks, and the weeks into months, Cain began to see that peace was not about perfection. It was about acceptance, humility, and the willingness to keep moving forward, to keep doing good, even when the past threatened to cloud his judgment.
One evening, as he sat by the fire, Cain reflected on his journey so far. The old man's words from years ago echoed in his mind, "You must forgive yourself." He had thought they were simple words, but now he understood their depth. Forgiveness was not something that could be given in a single moment. It was a process,
an ongoing choice to release the chains of guilt and shame. As he gazed into the fire, Cain realized that the life he now lived, though marked by mistakes, was still worth living. He had given his past to God, and with that, he had given himself the chance to be free. His work, his kindness, his small acts of service, they were not about earning forgiveness, but about living out the redemption he had already accepted within his heart. The boy who had once helped him in the fields came to him once again, his bright eyes full of the same curiosity and hope that had first inspired Cain to mentor him. "Cain," the boy said, "what do you think is the most important thing we can do in life?" Cain paused for a moment, considering the boy's question. He had spent much of his life looking for answers, searching for a way to make sense of the pain and the regret that had defined him. And now, with a sense of clarity, he replied, "I think the most important thing we can do is to keep choosing love, to love others, to love ourselves, and to trust that even when we make mistakes, we have the power to change and move forward." The boy smiled, nodding, and Cain realized that in this moment, he had passed on more than just knowledge about the land. He had shared the truth of his own journey, that redemption wasn't about being perfect, but about choosing to love and to grow despite the mistakes that would always remain a part of him. As Cain looked around at the village that had become his home, he felt a deep sense of gratitude. The people here had unknowingly offered him the healing he had searched for, but more importantly, they had helped him understand the power of connection, forgiveness, and acceptance. It was not a perfect life, but it was his life, a life he had fought to reclaim, step by step, day by day. For the first time in many years, Cain felt truly free, not because he had erased his past, but because he had accepted it. He had made peace with the man he had been and with the man he had become. And now, as he looked forward to the rest of his journey, he felt a sense of purpose and hope that had once seemed impossible. As the fire crackled in the quiet of the night, Cain whispered a prayer, not for forgiveness, that had already been given, but for the strength to continue walking the path of redemption. The road was long, but Cain knew that with each step, he was moving further away from the darkness of his past and closer to the light of his future. And that, in itself, was enough. The years continued to pass, and Cain's life in the village grew more grounded. His days were filled with work, community, and simple joys, things he had once thought were beyond his reach. He was no longer a wanderer searching for meaning in a world that seemed indifferent to his pain. Instead, he had found a purpose in the present, a new sense of belonging that came from contributing to the lives of those around him. But despite the peace he had found, there were still days when Cain was reminded of the darkness that had once consumed him. It wasn't the anger or jealousy that had driven him to murder, it was the weight of his past, the memory of Abel's blood on the earth, the guilt that had once paralyzed him. He had forgiven himself, or at least he believed he had, but there were moments when the past would resurface, and Cain would question whether he could ever truly be free from the consequences of his actions.
In the quiet of the night, Cain often found himself looking up at the stars, contemplating the journey that had brought him to this place. The village had become his home, and the people there had unknowingly helped him heal in ways he couldn't have imagined. But even among them, there were times when he felt like an outsider, marked by a past that no one truly understood. He had never shared the full story of his sin, of his brother's death, with anyone. It was a secret he carried alone, a burden that never fully left him. One day, while working alongside the villagers, a thought began to stir within him. He had spent so many years avoiding his past, hiding from it, trying to move forward without truly confronting what he had done. But now, he realized, He couldn't continue to live this way. The peace he had found was real, but it was incomplete. True peace, he understood, would only come when he fully embraced the truth of his actions, when he stopped running from the man he had once been and began to reconcile with his past in a more profound way. That evening, Cain went to the edge of the village, to the spot where he had first confronted the memory of his sin, the place where Abel had died. The land here still felt different to him, a mixture of sorrow and reverence. He stood silently, feeling the weight of his past pressing down on him once again. It had been so long since he had come to terms with what he had done, but he knew now that he had to revisit that moment, not as a way to punish himself, but as a way to acknowledge the full depth of his sin. He had carried this burden for so long, and only by facing it again could he hope to truly let go of its hold on him. Cain knelt to the ground, the earth cool beneath his hands. "I can never undo it," he whispered, his voice breaking through the quiet stillness. "But I can live differently. I can make this right by living in a way that honors you, Abel, and the life I have now. I can try to be better."
For the first time in many years, Cain felt a sense of release. It was not an overwhelming feeling of forgiveness or absolution. Those things were beyond his reach. But it was a release from the burden of denial, from the shame that had held him captive for so long. By acknowledging the full weight of his sin, he had allowed himself to begin the final step of his redemption, truly accepting responsibility for his actions. He didn't know what the future held, and he didn't know if he would ever be fully free from the memories of his past. But what he did know was that, for the first time, he was truly living for today. The past would always be a part of him, but it no longer had to define him. He had the power to choose how he lived, and with each passing day, Cain chose to live with integrity, humility, and kindness, to honor the lessons of his past by creating a future rooted in goodness. As Cain stood and looked out over the land, the first stars of the evening began to appear in the sky. He didn't have all the answers, and he knew that his journey would never truly be over. But he had made peace with who he was, with what he had done, and with the choices he would continue to make. And for the first time in his life, Cain felt that he was walking in the light, no longer burdened by the weight of his past, but embracing the future with a heart open to change. In that moment, Cain understood that redemption was not about perfection. It was about accepting one's flaws, making amends where possible, and living with the resolve to be better each day. He had come so far from the man who had killed his brother, and though the scars of his past would never disappear, he had learned to carry them with grace. And so, Cain continued his journey, a journey not of running away from the past, but of walking forward with the knowledge that the future, while uncertain, was his to shape. The road ahead was long, but with each step, he moved closer to the peace he had long sought, not in escaping his past, but in accepting it, learning from it, and allowing it to guide him toward a brighter tomorrow.
Years passed, and the seasons continued to change as they always did. Cain had settled into the rhythm of life in the village, where he had become a valued member of the community. His work in the fields, though still difficult, had become a symbol of his commitment to rebuilding his life. The villagers had come to trust him, not because of his past, but because of the way he lived now, with integrity, humility, and an unwavering dedication to helping others. Cain's reputation, which had once been tarnished by his sin, was now built on the quiet actions of a man who sought to do good, despite the darkness that had once defined him. Yet, even as Cain found peace in the present, the past still had a way of finding him. There were moments in the stillness of the night or in the solitude of the fields when the weight of what he had done would press heavily upon him. The memory of Abel, though softened with time, would resurface in moments of quiet reflection. And while Cain had long since accepted the reality of his actions and made peace with his past, there were times when the sorrow of his sin felt as sharp as it had the day he struck his brother down. Still, Cain moved forward. He had found meaning in his life once again, and his sense of purpose had shifted from survival to contribution. He taught the younger villagers how to work the land. He helped tend to the sick, and he supported the elders who had shown him kindness when he had first arrived. He had learned that redemption was not a one-time event, but a lifelong process, a daily choice to live in a way that honored both the past and the future. One afternoon, as he worked alongside a young boy who had become like a son to him, Cain was confronted by a figure from his past. The man was not someone Cain had seen in many years, one of the few who had known him before his exile, before his transformation. The man stood at the edge of the village, hesitant but determined, his eyes searching for Cain.
When their eyes met, Cain felt a surge of unease. His past was approaching, and for the first time in many years, he was unsure of how to face it. He had worked so hard to build a life here, to move forward, and yet the past had not forgotten him. "Cain," the man said softly, his voice carrying a weight that echoed the years. "It's been a long time." Cain stood frozen, unsure of how to respond. The man, seeing his hesitation, stepped closer. "I've heard the stories. They say you've changed. They say you found peace here." Cain nodded, swallowing the lump that had formed in his throat. "I have, but I can't change what happened. I can't undo the past." The man nodded as well, his eyes filled with understanding. "I know, but I've come to ask you for something I think you can offer." Cain frowned, confused. "What is it you want from me?" "I want you to tell the truth about what happened, about Abel." The words hit Cain like a blow. He had spent so many years hiding from the truth, burying it deep inside. The weight of his brother's death had been his alone to carry. He had never shared it with anyone, not even to those closest to him. And now, the very person he had hoped would never find him was asking for the truth. Cain's mind raced, and for a moment he considered running, escaping once again. But something within him stopped him. It was not fear that held him in place, but a deep recognition that this moment, this request, was the final test he had been avoiding all along. To fully embrace peace, he knew he had to confront this last part of his journey. He could no longer hide from the truth.
"I killed him," Cain said, the words slipping from his lips more easily than he had expected. "I killed my brother, and I will carry that for the rest of my life. No matter how much good I do, no matter how hard I try to change, I cannot erase that." For a long moment, the man stood silent, as if processing Cain's words. Finally, he spoke. "And what do you want from me? What do you want from anyone?" "I want to live without fear of being hunted down," Cain said quietly. "I want to find peace, not in hiding, but in living. I want to make things right in whatever way I can." The man's gaze softened. "Then you've already begun. You've already done more than most ever will." Cain met his gaze, and for the first time he felt the full weight of what he had done, not as a burden, but as a truth he could no longer escape. And in that moment, he felt something shift deep within him. His path had been long and fraught with pain, but here, in this moment, he realized that his redemption was not defined by the world's judgment, but by his willingness to live with the truth and to seek peace, regardless of his past. The man turned and walked away, leaving Cain standing alone. But Cain did not feel alone. For the first time, he felt free, not from the consequences of his sin, but from the chains of guilt and denial that had held him captive for so long. As the sun set on that evening, casting a warm glow across the village, Cain looked out over the fields where he had worked so hard to rebuild his life. He knew that the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in his life, he felt ready to walk it with his head held high. He had faced the truth, and in doing so, he had found the final piece of the redemption he had sought for so long.
Cain had spent so many years running from his past, but now he understood that true peace would never come from hiding. It would come from accepting who he had been and choosing to live in a way that honored the man he was becoming. And that, he realized, was enough. The days in the village became more peaceful for Cain, though the path had never been entirely free of obstacles. Despite the calm that surrounded him, he was aware that peace is not a destination, but a continuous journey, one that required constant effort. In his interactions with others, in his work, and in his quiet moments of reflection, Cain realized that redemption was not an event, but an ongoing process, a commitment to living with integrity every day. He had been haunted by his past for so long, but now he saw it differently. His sin was part of him, and though it could never be erased, it had helped shape the man he had become. Cain had learned that true redemption came not from denying the past, but from accepting it. The guilt, the loss, and the tragedy, all of it had led him to this moment of understanding. And it was through this understanding that Cain was able to offer himself the forgiveness he had long denied. One day, as the sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden glow over the land, Cain walked to the edge of the village. The familiar path seemed different now, almost sacred. It was here that his journey had truly begun, and here that he had come to terms with his past. The memories of his crimes still lingered, but they no longer controlled him. The weight of Abel's death, while heavy, was no longer a burden he carried in isolation. It had become a part of his story, a painful but necessary chapter that had led him to a place of inner peace.
The villagers had never asked Cain about his past. They had never pressed him to reveal the details of the sin that had shaped his life. To them, he was simply Cain, the man who worked alongside them, who shared in their joys and sorrows. But Cain knew that in order to fully embrace his redemption, he needed to share his story, not for their forgiveness, but for his own. He had spent so much time hiding from the truth, from the very essence of what he had done, and it was time for that to change. That evening, as the village gathered around the fire, Cain stood and addressed the people. His heart was steady, his voice calm, as he spoke of the past that had haunted him for so long. "I want to share something with you all," Cain began. "I've carried a heavy burden in my life.
I have lived with guilt and shame for something I did many years ago. I killed my brother, Abel, and I've spent my life trying to make up for it, running from it and hiding from the truth. But I've learned that redemption is not about hiding or running. It's about facing the truth, accepting it, and choosing to live differently. There was silence in the air, the crackling of the fire the only sound that filled the space. The villagers listened quietly, their faces reflecting understanding, but no judgment. Cain continued, his words coming from a place of deep reflection. I don't expect forgiveness from any of you, nor do I deserve it. But I need to say this because I've carried this secret for too long. I've made mistakes, and I can't change the past, but I can live differently now. I can work to be a better man, to contribute, and to offer what I can to this world. The pain of my sin will always be with me, but it will not define me.
Cain paused for a moment, allowing the weight of his words to settle. The firelight flickered in the eyes of the villagers, and Cain felt a strange sense of relief. For the first time, he felt the truth of his words sink deep into his heart. I just wanted you to know that I am trying, and I will continue to try, to live a life that reflects the lessons I've learned from my mistakes. I don't ask for your forgiveness, but I do ask for your understanding. And I hope, in time, you will see that I am not the man I once was. As he finished speaking, there was a long pause. The villagers exchanged glances, but there was no anger, no condemnation in their eyes. Instead, there was compassion. They knew Cain's past, but they also saw the man he had become. A man who had faced his darkest moments, who had struggled with the consequences of his actions, and who was now striving to live a better life. After a few moments, one of the elders, a woman who had watched Cain grow over the years, stood and walked to him. She placed a hand on his shoulder and spoke softly, her voice filled with kindness. We all have our struggles, Cain. And we all have things we wish we could change. But what matters is how we choose to live now. You've shown us that redemption isn't just about what we've done, but about what we choose to do with what we've learned. And for that, we respect you. Cain looked into her eyes and felt a warmth in his chest. The burden of his past, though it would never completely disappear, felt lighter now. For the first time in years, he realized that he was no longer defined by his sin. He was defined by his actions, by his willingness to change, and by the way he chose to live each day. That night, as Cain sat alone by the fire, he finally felt the peace he had been seeking for so long. The past, with all its pain and sorrow, was no longer a shadow hanging over him. It was part of his story, yes, but it no longer controlled him. He had faced it, spoken the truth, and allowed himself to move forward. Redemption, Cain understood now, was not a destination, but a journey that would continue as long as he lived.
And as the stars twinkled above, Cain whispered a prayer, not asking for forgiveness, but for strength to continue walking the path he had chosen. He had found peace, and now, with each step, he was creating a future that was not defined by his past, but by the man he had become. The years passed, and Cain's life continued to unfold in the quiet village where he had found solace. The burden of his past was no longer a constant weight upon his shoulders, but rather something he carried with a quiet acceptance. The echoes of Abel's death no longer haunted him in the same way. They still lingered, But instead of being a source of endless torment, they had become a part of his story, one that he had come to accept and learn from. Cain had grown old in the village, and though the memories of his sin would never fully fade, he had come to realize that redemption was not about erasing the past, but about living a life that reflected the lessons learned from it. Every day, Cain sought to live with integrity, humility, and kindness. He had built relationships with those around him, not by hiding his past, but by being honest about it and showing, through his actions, that he was no longer the man he once was. The villagers had long accepted him for who he had become, not who he had been. They respected him for his wisdom, his hard work, and his willingness to help others. They knew nothing of his dark past, and Cain had never felt the need to reveal it. His journey of redemption had been his own, and he had found peace in the quiet, unspoken understanding that he had worked tirelessly to rebuild his life.
One evening, as Cain sat outside his home, watching the sunset paint the sky in hues of orange and purple, he felt a sense of calm wash over him. The years of hard work, the struggles with his guilt, and the endless search for peace had finally come to a close. He was no longer a man defined by his past mistakes, but by the choices he had made in the present, the choices to love, to forgive, and to contribute to the world in ways that mattered. As he gazed out at the horizon, the memories of Abel came to him once again, but this time they didn't bring sorrow. Instead, he remembered his brother with a quiet fondness, the way he had once been, the bond they had shared. Cain had long accepted the fact that he could never undo what he had done, but in his heart he had come to understand that redemption was not about changing the past. It was about how one lived with it, how one chose to carry it forward, and how one used the lessons of the past to build a better future. The boy who had once come to him for guidance was now a man, grown strong and wise from the lessons Cain had shared with him. He had become a trusted member of the community, just as Cain had hoped he would. In many ways, Cain saw in the boy the potential for something better, something that had been born from the hard work of healing and redemption. And in that, Cain found peace, knowing that the future was no longer a place of fear, but a place of hope. As the stars began to twinkle in the night sky, Cain closed his eyes and whispered a prayer. It was not for forgiveness, for he had already forgiven himself. It was not for redemption, for he had already found it. It was simply a prayer of gratitude for the life he had been given, for the lessons he had learned, and for the strength to carry on no matter what had come before.
And in that moment, Cain understood fully what he had spent so many years seeking: peace. Not the kind of peace that came from a life without struggle or sin, but the kind of peace that came from within. The peace that arises when one stops running from the past, faces the truth, and chooses to live with grace and humility. It was the peace that came from knowing that the journey was never about perfection, but about the courage to move forward, no matter the weight of the past. Cain's journey had been long, and the road had been difficult, but he had come to a place of acceptance, of peace, and of love. And as he sat there, watching the stars above, he knew that at last he had found the freedom he had been searching for all along. Did you like the video? Don't forget to leave your like and share it with your friends. Subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any exciting stories, and activate the bell to receive notifications firsthand. And we want to know your opinion. Comment below what you thought of this video and share your thoughts with us.
Let's be part of this journey of faith and learning together.